All right, good morning. Hope everyone had a good night's sleep and a nice breakfast this morning. A reminder for everyone, they asked me to kind of let people know, like, if you want credits for attending the presentation, kind of you need to jump in your app and check in. So if you like your credits, then please go do that. So this morning we're going to talk about integrated testing with fire and life safety systems. Typical AIA stuff. We're going to learn some various things about integrated testing of fire protection life safety systems. We're going to learn a little bit about NFPA 3 and NFPA 4. And hopefully you get some good takeaways from that. So here's a little roadmap of what we're going to be kind of overviewing today. We're going to talk about commissioning, NFPA 3 for fire and life safety systems, integrated testing, NFPA 4. We're going to go over integrated testing plans, integrating testing report, integrated testing for existing buildings, and what codes are adopting NFPA 4. And we're going to go over the integrated testing team, and we're going to go through some examples in a hospital of various things that kind of get looked at for the overall holistic approach, and then we're going to wrap up and have some questions. So for me, a little bit about me. My background, I have an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering and a master's degree in fire protection engineering, and I've been, for 30 plus years now, been doing fire and life safety systems design, testing, commissioning, integrated testing. So that's where I am coming from, and I also sit on the technical subcommittees that wrote NFPA 3 and NFPA 4 that we're talking about today. So a little poll question. So for the audience, how would you describe your experience level in commissioning fire protection life safety systems? Please raise your hand if you have really basically no experience. All right. Raise your hand if you have a little experience. All right. Raise your hand if you have some experience. All right. And then finally, those that have a significant amount of experience. All right. So we have a little bit of everything in the audience today, which is good. So what is NFPA 3? So NFPA 3 is the only ANSI-approved commissioning document that deals with fire protection and life safety systems. It's very different. There's similarities, but there's some distinct nuances between more traditional commissioning, MEP-type commissioning kind of being done. But here's a definition out of NFPA 3. For commissioning of fire and life safety systems. A systematic process that provides documented confirmation that the building systems function according to the intended design criteria set forth in the project documents and satisfy the owner's operational needs, including compliance with applicable laws, regulations, codes, and standards. That last part is a big difference of what it means to commission a fire and life safety system, and we'll get into that a little bit. The other thing that the standard does is it introduces a new term, fire commissioning agent. So this fire commissioning agent is specifically for the fire and life safety systems. They're not commissioning other parts of the building, kind of whatever. Their specialty is the fire and life safety systems. So what does applicable laws, regulations, codes, and standards mean if you have to kind of make sure you comply with that? Well, it means you need to review beyond the basis of designed or the approved plans or the OPR. You need to understand the required locally adopted codes and standards that apply to the particular fire protection and life safety system. You're trying to verify the system conformance to these requirements. There's an added responsibility and risk in performing commissioning of fire and life safety systems. And the fire protection life safety systems have a higher level because you're trying to review it against applicable laws, regulations, codes, and standards. It does not eliminate the responsibility of the contractor, engineer of record, architect, or the local building or fire official. You just have your little piece of the responsibility pie, but make no mistake, you do take on some added responsibility in commissioning fire and life safety systems. The local authority having jurisdiction, whether they're the building or fire department, ultimately approves and accepts the fire and life safety systems. People oftentimes confuse that means, well, that means it's code compliant because they accepted it. That is not what that means. That means they accepted it. Everyone else responsible, the design team and everybody that was involved in the project is still responsible for meeting code. There's no legal obligation for the code official to make sure that you comply with all the parts of the code. You would hope that's what they're doing, right? Like they kind of know the code and kind of do that. But technically, a building or fire official could walk in a building, say, give me the reports, not test a single thing, sign it, and walk out of the building. And they have the legal authority to kind of do that. You hope that's not what they are doing, but that's how it is. So what's NFPA 4? NFPA 4 deals with integrated testing of fire protection life safety systems. And why this was developed, NFPA realized that all its, basically there's a NFPA standard for each of the fire and life safety systems. Fire alarm system is NFPA 72. And each of the standards that dealt with the individual systems tell you how to test it and how far you have to go. And what they realized is all the individual systems only test to a certain point. They never test the integration through a bunch of systems. So I'll give you an example on the fire alarm system. The fire alarm system has a relay that connects to the elevator controls, and it's one of the things that does elevator recall as one of the features. NFPA 72 makes the fire alarm person test up to their relay that interfaces with the elevator controls. The elevator person tests, on their side, but there's no one required to test that from one end to the other end, that it all works, end to end. So NFPA realized there was a shortfall in some of those things. This is the only ANSI-approved document regarding integrated testing of fire protection life safety systems. And that's what this document does. It bridges that gap in between systems to kind of try to ensure that these things are working together, coordinated, and function properly. So what's an integrated systems test? Well, the definition out of NFPA 4 is a test performed on fire protection and life safety systems to confirm that operation, interaction, and coordination of multiple individual systems perform their intended function. All right. So as we discussed, NFPA 4 was developed to address that gap from end-to-end testing, and it introduces a new term, integrated testing agent. So the integrated testing agent is the one that is orchestrating putting the various systems through its paces to kind of ensure that things are working kind of properly. Interesting thing to note that, NFPA 4 assumes if you're doing integrated testing that all those systems have already been commissioned. So you're not redoing all the commissioning tests. It's a separate and distinct test. So fire protection is a holistic approach. So we start off and we have fire and life safety standards. We have product materials and systems. We have compartmentation and separations. It could be a fire-rated separation, a smoke barrier. There's all kinds of different kind of passive requirements in buildings. You have active systems like your fire alarm, your sprinkler, standpipe systems, those types of things. We have egress systems, stairwells, doors to the exterior, horizontal exits, exit passageways. Structural fire protection so that even in the event of a fire, that the building remains standing during that fire kind of event to allow people to egress. We have emergency operations, We have prevention and maintenance, that every fire and life safety system is supposed to have inspection, testing, and maintenance done to it throughout its life. So all of those things together kind of try to make the building safer for the people and property that are in the building. So who are the key stakeholders, kind of involved? Well, you have a lot of this stuff probably looks very, kind of familiar to those commissioning providers. So you have the owner, architect, engineer, the commissioning agent. If you're doing overall building commissioning, they're absolutely part, kind of, part of the team and overall kind of running the overall commissioning aspects of it. You have a fire commissioning agent that reports to the commissioning agent. An integrated testing agent, you have your contractors, subcontractors, registered design professionals, and authorities having jurisdiction. So, it's a laundry list of folks. A lot of it's similar to kind of what you probably have seen in the past, but the fire commissioning agent and integrated testing agent are new to the party. So NFPA 4 qualifications. So a qualified integrated testing agent is required. They're supposed to have advanced knowledge and experience in installation, operation, and the interfaces between the various systems. Once again, the comparisons are not only done to the OPR and the design documents, but to the applicable building, fire, and life safety codes. And you're responsible for reviewing, documenting, and testing the needed integration between the fire and life safety systems across the various systems. So, the codes that adopt NFPA 4. So, NFPA 4 is pulled in by the 2000 or 2021 editions of the International Building Code, International Fire Code, NFPA 101, also known as the Life Safety Code, and NFPA 1 Fire Code. In these codes, NFPA 4 is required for any new high-rise building, any building with smoke control, or buildings with 2 or more fire protection and life safety systems integrated. So as of a year ago, there were 28 states that had adopted the 2018 or 2021 version of those codes. And there's more being added to that list all the time, so that it's, eventually there'll be all the states that will be requiring this NFPA 4 testing.
When you say 2 or more fire protection and life safety, that's a sprinkler and fire alarm system.
Yep.
So that any building in those 2 is supposed to get.
Yeah, it's a pretty comprehensive list. But for that, a simple integrated testing plans allowed for simple buildings, and more complex integrated testing plans are needed for more complex buildings. So if you have a very basic building and you just have fire alarm and sprinkler, your integrated testing plan could literally be 1 page. Like, it could be extremely simple. So you're not trying to make a mountain out of a molehill. It's really just trying to kind of like say we need to test those interfaces. Once again, we're not redoing all the individual system testing. It's exercising those interfaces. So here are a few definitions. So subordinate is also a new term that kind of got kind of brought in at the IBC. And that is a system that is activated by another fire protection and life safety system. So when you have a fire alarm system activates a smoke control system or an elevator recall system, the smoke control system or the elevator recall system is considered a subordinate to the fire alarm system. Like the fire alarm system is kind of like the master, and those systems are subordinate to it because that system is controlling and telling people when they're supposed to be doing those things. So, you know, with NFPA 4, you're looking at a bunch of different subordinate fire protection life safety systems that could include smoke control, elevator control, HVAC, BMS, fire alarm, security and access control, suppression systems. The other thing that it does is it establishes, this isn't a one test that you're done. Like all fire and life safety systems, there's supposed to be some inspection, testing, and maintenance over the life of the system. Well, integrated testing is no different. So it establishes some intervals on how frequent you have to do those periodic tests. But the interesting note is, as part of the NFPA 4 process, the integrated testing agent can go through and establish what that periodic testing should be. So whether that's, hey, we need to do this every 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, it gets established, and then kind of that has to kind of go on for those integrated tests in the future. Integrated testing plan. So for new systems, the systems are supposed to include, and here's the laundry list of various things, you know, written verification that's been installed in accordance with the approved design documents, the list of individual systems to be tested, documentation of the individual systems per the applicable codes or standards, who the integrated testing team is, equipment required for testing, a comprehensive functional matrix depicting all system inputs and associated outputs function. So this is a big one. This is kind of, you know, all the things that you're trying to kind of verify input and output wise between the various systems. Test scenarios, so all this stuff is driven by creating test scenarios to kind of drive those inputs and outputs that you're looking to verify. List of needed drawings, RISE diagrams, control diagrams, a narrative description of the test scenarios, the extent of the systems to be tested under the direction of the ITA, a test schedule including the individual systems, and a periodic integrated testing frequency determined by the ITA. So that all those things are supposed to be in the integrated testing plan. So, integrated testing report. So yes, there is a report that gets pulled together and handed over to the building officials. So, you know, it's including all that information and the results of the integrated test. A narrative or matrix describing each test and their responses, a description of the status of each individual system, scenario details including where a condition was simulated or a device state change. You need to include a statement that says that all inputs and output functions of the integrated systems have been tested and operate as intended. You do need to have an issues log for any test results that did not comply, and then a resolutions log for those items that were corrected. Overall documentation of the testing process and results. The periodic testing period determined. And this all gets submitted to the building and fire department. And then the AHJ does their final acceptance testing. So one of the challenges is, you know, that all these systems need to get installed, they all need to get commissioned, and they need to do integrated testing, and then you bring the building and fire department out for their testing. So fitting that into this compact construction schedule and opening date, it's, you know, kind of an added challenge to kind of fit in at the end of the job. So there's also requirements for existing building integrated testing plan. So for an existing system, the integrated testing plan needs to include, to verify that the integrated systems function as required when initially installed. Testing should demonstrate and document the required responses have occurred in accordance with the plan. The integrated system test shall validate and document that the responses and interactions conform to the original design objectives and code requirements. And then, once again, the whole periodic integrated system testing. So there is, both new and existing kind of building. They alter a little bit. So here's the interesting thing for NFPA 4 for existing buildings. So every building with 2 or more interface fire alarm systems are required to develop an integrated testing plan within 5 years of adoption of NFPA 4. So when your local building code adopts the 2018 International Building Code, which pulls in NFPA 4, that's really for new buildings. But a clock is starting to tick. For existing buildings, retroactively, you have a 5-year window to pull together a test plan. And then you have a 5 to 10-year window, depending which edition gets adopted, to actually execute that integrated testing plan. So for existing fire life systems that are modified to become part of the integrated fire life system, an integrated test is required. So if all of a sudden you're making modifications or changes, the other thing that's a gotcha is changes that are made to site-specific software for individual system that is part of the integrated system. So if you have a fire alarm system panel upgrade or a BMS upgrade where you're like, hey, we're kind of modernizing and kind of bringing this stuff up, and it's part of an integration of the fire and life safety systems, that also triggers this integrated systems test, because now they want to make sure that as you upgrade or replace the fire alarm or BMS or whatever other type of system, that it's interwoven and interconnected appropriately for the building. So obviously we have new construction for NFPA 4 that's being dealt with. We have periodic testing, the inspection, testing, and maintenance for existing buildings. We have tenant improvements or renovation projects, depending what's happening with those tenant improvements or renovation projects. We have equipment modifications or upgrades, whether it's fire alarm, sprinkler, electrical, mechanical BMS, and software programming changes to like the fire alarm or for HVAC controls if it happens to be doing smoke control. So there's a lot of different opportunities where NFPA 4 may be getting pulled in your local jurisdiction. So the other thing that's a little different for commissioning and integrated testing of fire protection life safety systems is most of those systems sit dormant. They're kind of like sitting in the background until you need, an emergency happens and they need to spring into action. So they're not necessarily kind of getting worked and exercised, kind of every day. Those life safety systems are essential in protecting the occupants, the contents, and the building itself, and kind of real importantly, trying to notify those building occupants to get out during an emergency. So whether people realize it or not, owners are legally obligated everywhere in the U.S. to have properly functioning fire protection life safety systems, and they're supposed to be maintaining and testing these systems. So the codes and standards put this onus on the owners. They could pass it on in writing to, a property manager or other firm, or to service contractors to kind of service those individual systems, but the starting charges, the owners are responsible. The complex integration of fire protection systems are at an all-time high, but buildings are becoming more and more complex even outside of fire alarm systems. There's more integration and more things going on with green buildings or, net carbon zero buildings, or there's all kinds of integrations that are occurring. So non-commissioned or integrated tested or improperly commissioned or integrated tested fire protection systems are a liability for the owners and the commissioning and IT firms kind of doing it. So just make sure you understand that, there is some enhanced level of oversight and looking at those applicable codes as part of any of these fire protection life safety systems. So here's a sample list of some of the integration systems that could potentially be involved. You're not going to have these in every building, but it kind of runs the gamut. I'm not going to run through all the various things, but there are things like, lighting controls that people don't necessarily think about. If you have all kinds of extensive lighting controls and there's an emergency and, you need to kind of put up those lights, or maybe you're in a large assembly building where there's a requirement to put up the house lights so people can evacuate, in a timely manner. So there's all different types of circumstances where these may be tied into a fire life safety system. They're not always. So an input-output matrix, and this isn't even like a complex one, but you still can't read it. There's like all kinds of inputs and outputs that are trying to get verified across various systems. So who is the integrated testing team? So I like to kind of call them the A team, kind of showing my age, kind of from the 1980s A team with Mr. T and kind of whatever. I'm sure there's some people in the audience that are going, what is he talking about? Kind of, but you can look it up afterwards. So at a minimum, the integrated team needs to include the integrated testing agent, the installation, testing, and maintenance personnel for each integrated system. So as part, the personnel responsible for the integrated testing shall be qualified for their portion of the integrated tests, and the team may consist of, and there's a whole laundry list, right? So you don't have to have people there if that's not part of your integrated system test, but you could have your fire alarm service company, sprinkler, fire pump, HVAC, BMS, lighting controls, emergency standby power, audio controls, access controls, certified air balance contractor doing your tab work, electrical, elevator, security, commissioning agent, right? So depending on how complex and the systems that you have in your particular building, you might have some or all of these folks on this integrated testing team. So we're going to take a little bit of time and kind of talk a little about integrated testing of fire and life safety systems in hospitals. So hospitals are very complex. They're very congested above the ceiling. You have, added complexities with things like infectious control or trying to maintain various pressure differentials across, various areas of the hospital. You might have layered pressure differentials between labs, operating rooms, smoke control systems. It can kind of get very complicated and nuanced. And, you actually need to kind of go test these in all the various scenarios. So if you have a smoke control system in your building, you need to make sure everything's balanced and working properly when the smoke control system's not working. But then you also need to activate the smoke control and re-verify all those things are still being met. So there's another layer being added to that. Now, there's certainly hospitals that don't have a smoke control system, but there's certainly some that do. So that if you do, there's some added complexity there. If you're dealing with an existing building, obviously it's a 24/7, 365-day-a-year occupied building, and that presents its own challenges. And there's also multiple authorities having jurisdictions with hospital, right? So you have the local building and fire department, but you have CMS through the approved organizations such as the Joint Commission. So you're trying to make a lot of different people happy, right? So, and you got to make sure all those various people are happy at the end of the day when you're kind of going through these CMS is the organization that kind of like certifies basically any hospital that gets federal funding, which they all do, Medicare, Medicaid, kind of whatever, that's a requirement. Now I'm trying to remember what CMS stands for, kind of, there you go. We have too many acronyms, but So what are some other unique hospital situations? So unlike an office building or, kind of other type of buildings, hospitals have a defend-in-place strategy, right? So if someone's in an intensive care unit or an operating room and you're having open heart surgery and the fire alarm system goes off, they don't drop everything and just run out of the building. So that means, from a fire and life safety standpoint, they do things differently in a hospital than in an office building. So there's added extra levels of safety because of that. So we're not, if a hospital's totally evacuating, it's real bad, like extremely bad. Like the hospital's flooding and they need to get people out, and like it's that is the last resort for hospitals. They might plan and have a plan on how to do some of that stuff, but it's the last thing they kind of want to do. There's also unique areas in the hospital, right? So each area has different needs and requirements. So the lobby is different than the intensive care unit, is different than the maternity ward, which is different than the PACU in the operating room, right? So there's different things going on in those areas that warrant extra attention. And basically, the codes permit, the codes aren't very good at saying kind of like, oh, this is exactly how you do a hospital building. The codes allow nuanced changes from like an office, from like an office building to a hospital. So the codes basically say, hey, you need to alarm your building and get your people out. The code doesn't really talk about a defend-in-place strategy. The various standards kind of allow for consideration to kind of do those things with approval from the local authority, kind of whatever. But that's generally kind of like how things are done for hospitals. You also have security, kind of issues. Maybe you're in the maternity ward with the newborns and kind of whatever, and kind of, baby abductions are a thing. So they kind of, like there's added security and things that are done to kind of protect those babies from someone snatching one and trying to run off with it. So some of these patients can't relocate due to the patient's circumstances, right? If you're in an intensive care unit and, you're probably in an intensive care unit because things are very poor health-wise, and kind of you're needing a lot of attention, medicine, hooked up to equipment, what have you. They're not able to just kind of grab that person and just kind of take off. So, and we'll go into a little bit more of this defend-in-place strategy. But that staff needs to be notified of that emergency condition without disturbing the patients. So, would it be very helpful in an operating room or an intensive care unit to have the fire alarm system, speakers blaring and strobes flashing when the doctor's doing open heart surgery on you? I don't think so, right? Like, that's not a good idea. So there's ways that could be dealt with to do that stuff, and we'll get into that a little bit. So with the hospitals, for existing hospitals, what are the challenges in integrated testing those? Well, they're always occupied, obviously. that end-to-end testing is a challenge, right? You kind of want to see things cascade through the building, kind of whatever. Then, that's not something they're going to really, kind of like to do. People training are part of the integration. We're going to get into this a little bit in the upcoming slide, where staff are trained in how to deal with emergencies depending on where that emergency is happening in the hospital. So, you might have a nurse's station with a fire alarm annunciator that lets the nurses know, hey, there's an event and it's in your zone or in another zone or it's on the other side of the hospital, and they're trained to kind of react differently depending on where that fire or smoke or emergency situation is. Testing life safety systems on normal and emergency power. So that's a challenge, the emergency power part. Lots of coordination with service vendors, facilities, and the healthcare staff, right? So you can imagine you're gonna have to kind of get all your ducks in a row to be able to kind of go through an existing healthcare facility and kind of go do all this integrated testing. So here's an intensive care unit, and the evacuation zones are done by suites, and this is one ICO suite, and here's another ICO suite. And those suites are separated by this red line, which is a smoke barrier. And the reason they like using suites in hospitals is it gets rid of the fire-rated corridors and door closers that you normally would have in a healthcare facility, but then they kind of shrink the size of the suite that you're allowed. There's a lot more things where the nurses can kind of see the patients. The ICU, obviously, it's intensive care, right? So the nurses are regularly in and out and kind of monitoring kind of those patients, and the medical staff are really responsible for the well-being of those patients. So they like seeing them and kind of being able to kind of do those things. Well, the fire and life safety systems have to be zoned to allow the nurses to kind of know where that fire is. So these evacuation zones are done to like the smoke barriers. That also means like things like the sprinkler system needs to match the fire alarm system zoning, because you can't have a sprinkler system having a sprinkler on zone A and another sprinkler on zone B, because if the fire sprinkler goes off, you can't tell whether the fire was in zone A or zone B, right? So now there's an added level of coordination and effort that needs to be done to make sure those match up, line up. The other thing for ICU, ORs, kind of whatever, once again, like a code approach that's often used is called private mode in fire alarm. So you're eliminating the speakers and strobes and that sort of thing in the area, like an intensive care unit, and you're replacing it with like a fire alarm annunciator at the nurse station. So if there's an event, they get their beep or their sound from the fire alarm annunciator. There's someone always at the nurse's station, and they're able to kind of look at it, and they're trained on, okay, this alarm comes up, and okay, is that my zone, someone else's zone? And they kind of have different responsibilities depending on where that alarm is coming in. You might have on the smoke barrier, for example, in between the suites, there could be doors on hold opens. So they're magnetic hold opens, but in an alarm, those need to release and close to kind of compartmentize and kind of segregate those different suites. So the defend in place strategy is this. So let's just say we have a fire in this ICU kind of this portion over here. And either the nurses see it or they see the signal come in. So the first thing they do, if you're a nurse in the area that has the fire originating in it, they run around and close all the patient doors. Because they're not moving all these patients, they're trying to compartment and keep those people safe. The only time they try to move someone is if the fire originates in the individual patient's room. So if the fire's in their room, then they'll kind of go through the measures of getting that person out of that room, closing that door, and trying to keep the fire to that kind of like one room. And then nurses in other portions, maybe you're in a suite, kind of on the floor above, they might relocate patients just as a precaution where they're not in imminent danger, but they might kind of move them, to a slightly safer location where they're not as close to the hazard. So that's what like a defend-in-place strategy kind of like is, which is obviously way different than your typical office building, mall, restaurant, kind of whatever, right? Usually kind of the fire alarm system goes off and you're expecting people to, get up and evacuate the building. So hospitals are a little different, and that's what kind of why there's some added complexity and challenges for that. The other thing is, not all hospitals are high-rises, but there certainly are hospitals that are high-rises, right? So if you're a high-rise building, now all of a sudden you have a smoke control system minimally for your stair pressurization. So here's an exit stair, and that exit stair is inside the building, and it needs to kind of get to the outside of the building. So you see this little green hatched kind of area? That's called a 2-hour exit passageway. It's basically a horizontal extension of the stair. So you're supposed to have the same level of safety in that stair that you came down in. You traverse this exit passageway, and you kind of get to this other stair that's on the exterior of the building that will discharge to grade when you get to the lower level. Well, this exit passageway is essentially part of the stair, so it becomes part of the pressurized stair. So now all of a sudden you have a pressurized stair here going into this corridor that also needs to maintain pressure differentials to another stair that also needs to maintain pressure differentials. So that whole thing, once you're in that stair envelope and you're protected, with the smoke, with the stair pressurization, that continues all the way out until you're out of the stair. So there's some added pressure differentials that you need to kind of take for things like that. You may have, because it's a high-rise building, you might also have a manual smoke evac purge system. So it's not automatic, but it'd be manual for all the various zones and areas of the hospital to kind of get, if there is a smoke event or a fire event, that they can, like in mop-up operations, the fire department can use it to kind of clear some smoke and do some of that stuff. At that time, there's no emergency, that people, kind of the fire department's on scene and they're kind of doing mop-up operations. You also have other things like, some ICUs are behavioral ICUs. So, for those patients, there's added security measures that are being added into that ICU because they don't want these people just to be able to walk out because maybe they're totally able-bodied but have some mental issues that they're having to kind of deal with and need help with. Well, then if you have those security measures get added in, that becomes part of the things, because all of a sudden if there's a fire alarm kind of going off, you also need to kind of be able to unlock things so that you can evacuate during an emergency with staff and kind of what have you. So there's a lot of different areas. You also could have secured doors in the ICU for drugs and a hazardous room that you might have access cards or keys or kind of whatever to kind of gain entry to some And there's things like the maternity ward for the newborns, kind of whatever I mentioned before, kind of some of these infant detection security systems to kind of make sure that someone's not trying to kind of abduct and kidnap a newborn. So a lot of these things for the fire life safety systems deal with egress items, fire rated items, and life safety systems, and they need to kind of work cohesively to keep people safe. So there's a lot of additional layers that you need to kind of be you need to know how the building's operating specifically and what you're dealing with to kind of be able to kind of know what you need to do as part of your integrated testing. We've had hospitals would actually, because they're in cities and the cost of land is super expensive, where they kind of have went down below grade a ton of levels. Well, if you have below grade levels more than 60 feet, the International Building Code requires you to have a floor smoke control system, split the floor in two, and you need to kind of do an active smoke control system on all those levels kind of below grade. So that's a real fun one, kind of trying to balance that with, labs, pharmacies, infectious control, all the other stuff that you need to kind of do. So that it can get very challenging to deal with some of these. They're not everyone has underground floors lower than 60 feet, but they're out there and they're challenging to kind of deal with. All right. So what are some of the takeaways? NFPA 3 commissioning, NFPA 4 integrated testing of fire protection life safety systems is way beyond review of the basic design of the OPR. It is required to review the applicable laws, regulations, codes, and standards. But part of that is we're trying to make these buildings safe, right, for these occupants. Whole building commissioning takes a team of qualified people, including specialists for fire alarm and life safety. Integrated testing of fire and life safety systems per NFPA 4 will be increasingly required on projects. Like I said, 29 states currently have a building or fire code that pull in NFPA 4, and more are coming. Experienced fire protection commissioning agent and integrated testing agents are both critical to be a member of the overall commissioning team. And now I'll take questions. No, there we go.
Excuse me. Who's considered a qualified fire protection commissioning agent? Is that a new certification?
There is currently no certifications for commissioning fire and life safety or integrated testing of fire and life safety systems, but the NFPA standards do say that people need to be qualified and experienced doing it. Ultimately, the local authority having jurisdiction can approve or disapprove someone and say, I don't think you're qualified, but there is no current certifications of that.
Follow-up, what qualification, if we were going to subcontract that, what would you look for as someone who is qualified in that field?
Well, when you're dealing with fire and life safety systems, right? So if you're commissioning individual systems, you need someone that has experience in those individual systems. And if you're doing integrated testing of those systems, you want someone experienced in testing those integration of those systems. So it's really trying to kind of say, like, what is your experience in, performing this type of, kind of services. Unfortunately, I know it's a lot easier to get a certification and just say, like, hey, it's black and white and kind of like, kind of what have you, but that's not where we're at currently, unfortunately. We have a question over here. Oh. You have someone in the back row. We'll get you next.
So once you've tested the fire alarm system, life safety system on normal power, how in depth do you go testing it on emergency power?
Well, it kind of depends. So you're trying to verify everything works, and you're trying to stress it out a little bit. So as an example, if that fire alarm system was also controlling a smoke control system, for me, I would normally kind of say, well, I'm going to stress the system out. So I'm going to start out my test on normal power. I'm going to activate a sprinkler water flow switch, which is going to kick on my fire pump, if I have a fire pump, kind of what have you, which is then going to initiate my smoke control system, and my fire alarm system are going to go off. That's a pretty decent load, on the system. And then we're going to drop power and switch over to emergency power to kind of make sure those ATSs kind of like, switch. So once again, we're not replicating the entire test. We're trying to verify those interfaces of those things for integrated testing. For normal testing, it's usually like, so the fire alarm systems have a battery backup requirement, and there's a battery in it, and kind of like the fire alarm system functions even if the generator doesn't kick on. Like there's a battery, and that's part of the test. Do these things kind of continue to kind of work, and do you have battery monitoring and supervision? And if you disconnect the batteries, do you know that the batteries are disconnected? So that's part of the normal fire alarm testing kind of like process. But the emergency generator piece of it is really trying to, stress it out and make it switch and do those things. Once it's operating, the fire alarm system program is going to do the same exact thing that it's done, because it's not relying on other, power from other locations for anything else. So I don't know if that quite answers your, question, but.
Yes, it did. That's what was one of the main things I was making sure. You test it heavily on normal power, and then emergency is just making sure that transfers over load, but everything should operate roughly.
Yeah, for straight fire alarm. For smoke control, you need to kind of go do a little more testing. So like you need to kind of make sure that your performance is kind of being met on both normal and emergency power. So I know your question was for fire alarm, but like there is a nuance if, you might not have a damper that's on emergency power that should be on emergency power, and all of a sudden your performance of your smoke control system isn't quite what it used to be, and you need to know that. So it kind of depends what system you're talking about, of how in depth you need to kind of do that. Smoke control systems are very performance oriented, right? You need to kind of meet a pressure differential or a certain volume, a CFM, or whatever you're doing, and you got to kind of verify that both in normal and emergency.
Okay, so you would add like a circuit verification element to it to verify it is on the correct panel.
Well, you're either verifying it then, or you're verifying it when you go to generator and
Right.
is everything kind of working right, and you figure out what's not on emergency power pretty quickly. I mean, I've
Right.
seen things where, the outside air damper was wired to normal power, but the fan's to emergency power. Well, it doesn't help you, so. We have some.
So you have 23 states that already adopted this procedure.
Yep.
How many of those buildings in those states have adopted NFPA 4 test completed?
Well, I guess part of it is, right, so for a new building, a state adopts a code, and then someone designing that building. So like the design phase is multi-year for a building, right? So if someone's just designing those buildings now, then they have to get built and they have to get tested. So it takes a while before you're actually kind of getting to, test some of these buildings. But there absolutely are buildings getting, like California is one of those states that have adopted it earlier. It's been enforced in California for, I think it's almost on 2 years now. So there are absolutely buildings that are doing NFPA 4 testing. I don't have a state by state, kind of like who's exactly doing how much in each state, but these are the code requirements. Yeah, we'll get someone with the mic and we'll go to you.
Hi. So I'm assuming that most of the attendees at this conference, such as myself, are commissioning agents, and for normal building systems commissioning, fire protection and life safety systems is somewhat of a different animal because of the liabilities. And our commissioning plans will spell out about what the roles and responsibilities are. But when you have a fire systems and life safety commissioning agent, that actually really changes the liabilities, as you mentioned at the start of your presentation. So I'm thinking that, is there a way to mitigate that? I mean, our commissioning plan expressly states that the commissioning agent is not the authority having jurisdiction. We're not responsible for code compliance. We don't have any authority over the contractor, but when you're doing this fire life safety commissioning, you actually do have to assume that role that, I mean, we can say that we're not responsible if something is non-compliant with the code, but say there is a fire and there is litigation, then the lawyers are going to spin it and say, well, you commissioned the system and you signed off on it, and therefore, we do have, we are incurring quite a bit of liability by commissioning this type of system. Is that?
Well, I guess my recommendation would be to make, part of your team, whether that's in-house or, kind of like, subbing that piece out or having someone else kind of perform that, kind of task, because someone should be doing it, right? If NFPA 4 is required, then it's required. And, kind of part of it is not everyone. One of the reasons I do this presentation is to kind of make people aware of, like, hey, the devil's in the details. When you get into this stuff, it's a higher level than the more traditional commissioning kind of is. For those of us that are in the fire life safety kind of business, that's like perfectly normal for us, because that's the area we kind of work in, and it's always like that, right? But as you mentioned, that's not, how commissioning providers are, right? They don't want that liability, and, kind of like there was even a movement to kind of move from commissioning agents to commissioning providers for that, like, very reason, right? So I would advocate for those that are doing it to kind of like, either put someone that can do that piece kind of like on your team, or kind of have, someone even as a separate contract kind of perform those, services. But, kind of, it's hard to dabble, right? It's hard to be like half pregnant, like you're either doing it or you're not doing it. Like, so there is some added risk when you say, like, hey, I'm gonna test it a little, but I'm not gonna test it all the way to that. Well, I don't know. The lawyers tend to have a field day with stuff if there happens to be an incident, right? That's when this stuff gets torn apart, and there's subject matter experts, and kind of all the things get kind of raked over the coals, kind of whatever.
Thank you.
Yep. I know we have a question down here. Oh.
Going to ask if you'd maybe compare, contrast the NFPA 4 commissioning, level commissioning. You talked about healthcare, but you didn't mention detention facilities, and
Yep.
I think
So
they're
that's
kind
another,
of the same
yep.
boat.
So, a lot of similarities. We just picked one example where there's a lot of complexity, but correctional facilities are also complicated because you have people in lockdown, and is also very, once again, trained staff, right? So an alarm goes off, they don't open up all the cells and just let the inmates kind of go, right? So, like, there are staff that are trained to kind of say, okay, here's the signal, and they become actually part of the integrated test. So, because they get this signal, and then they have to evaluate that stuff, and then they're kind of opening and closing certain doors based on the safety of that. All right, and I'll stick around for a few minutes if anyone else has any other questions or things they'd like to talk, but thank you very much for your time today.